Good morning. My name is Cassidy, and I am just really happy to be here this morning. I have actually not been here the last 2 weekends because we took our first kid-free vacation. So some of you know, right, what a treasure that was to get some time away from sort of the monotonous routine and life of parenting. We went out to Utah, we hiked for a week, got to spend an extra night in Vegas with some friends, so the Boys II Men show. You know, if anybody knows how you feel about Boys II Men, that's how I feel about Boys II Men. So it was just an awesome, awesome time, but I will say the one thing about being away, sort of step two right after missing our kids, was that we missed being here on Sundays, to miss 2 Sundays in a row. So I'm just so happy to be here today, and happy to be here sort of anchoring a series that we've been in for the last 3 weeks. So the series is titled Good Enough, where we've sort of wondered about this concept, this really difficult concept of enough. We've looked at it the last 3 weeks through 3 different lenses, all of which sort of seemed anchored in the perspective of satisfaction. In week 1, we wondered, are we enough? Am I enough? In week 2, we wondered, how much is enough? Week 3 was, is there enough for everybody? But here in week 4, we're going to take a little different turn, and we're going to look at it from the side of excess. What do we do when we've had enough? We typically capture this kind of sentiment with a really kind of often repeated phrase, enough is enough, right? We kind of know that sentiment. Enough is enough shows up in song lyrics all the time, and if you go on Amazon, you can find countless books with that title. And it's oftentimes the battle cry that sort of stirs up some kind of community activism, right? Enough is enough. So I'm certain this morning you can take a second and think about the things in your own life today where you feel that way. So let's do that here just for a moment. Think about what those enough is enough moments are for you today. So if you've got one or two in your mind and you can share it in a couple of words, I'd love to hear from the community. What are some things right now among us that we've just had enough of? Shout them out if you've got something. My children's poor behavior, and all the parents said amen. What else? Said student loans, had enough of paying those student loans. What else we got? Say here, a sense of entitlement. Just had enough of seeing and experiencing it around, right? Entitlement. Great. What else? Insecurities. Had enough of insecurities. What else? Video gaming. Had enough. Politics. Had enough of politics. I'm sure we all feel that way sometimes. What else we got? Braxton said he has had enough of blaming millennials for world problems. And Frank with the ink, millennials not taking responsibility for world problems. It sounds to me like Braxton and Frank need to get a gift card for a coffee date later this week. So, I mean, right, we could do this for a while because we all know this feeling. And I really appreciate sharing because it's really nice to know, right, that I'm not alone. I was thinking this week about some of my own enough is enoughs, one of which is I have had enough of our toddler not sleeping through the night, right? We have had I think we had 5 middle of the night wake-ups last night. I've had enough of it. But I've also had enough of other things, like I've had enough of some of the stuff I'm reading about in the news this week. I've had enough, right? And we all sort of know that sentiment sort of on all sides of things. There was actually a time even where after my first year of marriage, I thought I would write a book. And if I was going to write this book, could have titled it Enough is Enough. It would have been right there on Amazon, right, with all those other books with the same titles, and it would have been the perfect, appropriate title. This book would not have been the kind of book you would have expected someone to write after their first year of marriage. And with love to my husband, it wouldn't have been a gushing report of how much I loved my husband, I loved our new first home together, and married life was just such a perfect fit. My first year of marriage book would actually be a true story of pain and hardship, and I was going to write it right there with my fresh wounds of sadness, hurt, frustration, and with my future perspective that lacked much, if any, hope for improvement. So my 10-year wedding anniversary was last week, and I have yet to put pen to paper with this book. I have yet to ink down those deeply painful memories that still to this day have left scars everywhere I turn. I'd like to tell you that I never needed to write it, right? That the sunlight came streaming in soon after, or I turned the corner to hope and healing, and things have just been rosy and wonderful ever since. But the truth is that my first year fiasco gave way to a really long period of drought in my life, where pain rolled right into more pain, and I never really stopped for air. And without air, I never found the space to write. So here this morning is the book flap summary. The first time I've inked this part of my journey, let alone shared it publicly. So, after our beautiful, joyful wedding, surrounded by friends and family, our year went something like this. Watch our moving truck go up in flames, containing all of our wedding gifts, many family keepsakes, and most of my belongings. Move in with our in-laws while we recovered, which is every newlywed's dream. Then, right, end up in a lawsuit as a result of said accident because that truck belonged to my very angry boss. The boss who showed no sympathy for our losses, but instead blamed me for the impact that that accident had on business. So the next thing you know, I was unemployed, and our extended family then entered its own crisis. Unplanned pregnancy, drug addiction, rehab, terminal illnesses, sexual abuse, all while my husband and I were navigating our own crisis recovery and job loss. Family members were relying on us to be steadfast, ready to talk and help at any moment. Our brand spanking new marriage that hadn't yet even been given time to grow roots was bearing a heavy burden, and I felt alone. So that first year ended, and my perspective was simple. I had had enough of the bad, hard, sad stuff. All the expressions applied, right? My plate was full. My heart was heavy, and my hope was fading. The only small voice I could muster could only have said, enough is enough. But as much as I can tell you about the hard enoughs at this moment, from both my todays and my yesterdays, there are plenty of joy-filled enoughs in my life too. Hardship and blessing, they're often bumping up against each other. Sometimes they're held in equal measure, but other times one outweighs the other. And this is life, right? Mountain to valley, back to mountain again. Or light to dark, and back to light. And for as long as we're alive, we'll be balancing this dichotomy, sometimes on even grander scales. We'll be sitting with a grieving friend in hardship on the same day that our child overcomes a major obstacle, blessing. Or we will lose someone or something that we loved, hardship. But in some other way, we'll receive something that we'd always hoped for, blessing. We live in a this is just for a season or a this too shall pass kind of world. And in many ways, we have learned to manage all that that means for us. Enough is enough of the hard stuff, we can say, but we often have enough of the good stuff too. So I'd like to introduce you to some friends of mine, Jan, Scott, and Lucy. Some quick background. Jan and I were roommates our sophomore year of college at William and Mary. Go Tribe. I know we have some alums on this side of the room. While we were roommates, Jan met and started dating her now husband, Scott. A few years later, Jan and Scott missed my wedding. But I forgive them because they were in labor with their firstborn, their daughter, Lucy. So we're going to meet Jan and Lucy as featured in a recent docuseries by Discovery Health called First in Human.
Lucy Weiss has one of the rarest diseases in the world, Job syndrome. A genetic disorder that affects fewer than 300 people in the United States.
The music is great.
Thank you.
Lucy was first born. She was overall healthy, but she had a lot of what seemed to us at the time to be small, unrelated health issues. She had a lot of rashes, a lot of skin infections. She had a skull formation issue as well. And as she got a little bit older, we saw some gross motor delay. No one really knew what it was. It just didn't fit any normal mold.
Want to see how high I can climb?
You can try. Whoa, Lucy!
Ta-da! I'm taller than you, Mom.
Sure are.
When she was 3 years old, she was admitted to a hospital with esophageal thrush, which is very uncommon in patients her age who have a normally functioning immune system. They recognized Lucy's combination of symptoms for what they were, Job syndrome.
Hello, Lucy. Hello, Mom.
Those born with Jobs have an incomplete immune system, which can make some infections deadly.
Awesome, Lou. I love it.
By the time we got the diagnosis, it was almost a relief
Yes.
because it explained so much
I agree.
of what had been so confusing for the past 3 years.
There is no cure for Jobs. But since Lucy's diagnosis, she has been observed and treated at Building 10, which is a leading facility in the world for the study of rare diseases, and has a team devoted to Job syndrome.
Hold it. I'll get you down.
After several life-threatening infections, Lucy's doctors are now confronted with the task of trying to fix her dangerously incomplete immune system.
So if you recognize that voice, right, that is Jim Parsons, a.k.a. Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory. Does anybody watch that show? So he narrated this First in Human docuseries. It's 3 episodes, and it follows 4 patients through their journey at Building 10. And Building 10, if you caught it, is part of the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And here they partner medical research and medical care, and they often do this through first-of-their-kind of clinical trials. It aired last August on Discovery Health, and did anybody watch it by any chance? Anybody catch it? So I'll make sure the link gets shared this week because my guess is that you'll want to check up on Lucy's story through the rest of the docuseries. But we can't, unfortunately, watch it all together. So you saw a little bit about what led to Lucy's arrival at Building 10. But what wasn't detailed was all the hardship that Lucy had been through up until that point. She had had countless broken bones, lung infections, bouts with pneumonia, collapsed lungs, major operations, and more. And each winter, in particular, was getting harder and harder and longer and filled with more and more difficult trials. It was this that made Lucy and Jan and Scott agree with their medical team that they were going to take a chance on a clinical trial for Lucy. Everything was hard for them, and it seemed that it was only getting worse for the next year. So the clinical trial was primarily a bone marrow transplant, and Jan was the donor. And they were hopeful that doing so might contribute to a new, healthier immune system for Lucy. So if you caught it in the video, Lucy's rare disease is most commonly known as Job's syndrome. This draws its name from a biblical character, Job, whose story is also told in the book of the Bible called Job. So we're going to pause for just a moment from Lucy, and we're going to flip and think about Job and his story and see where that takes us. The book of Job in the Bibles on your table starts on page 287 if you'd like to follow along, but any relevant scriptures will be on the screen behind me. All right, so the thing about Job's story is that it sort of starts like a fairy tale. So just from the beginning, right, chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we hear this. A man in the land of Uz was named Job. That man was honest, a person of absolute integrity. He feared God and avoided evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters and owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 pairs of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a vast number of servants, so that he was greater than all the people of the East. But then something changes. And we could get stuck for a while on the background here, or the why behind this change. That's really a conversation for another day. So the Cliff Note version is this. Job's seemingly perfect life. He was greater than all the people of the East. He had all of these things to his name. Absolute integrity, honest, feared God. His seemingly perfect life collapsed around him. His homes were reduced to dust. His animals, his servants, and his children all killed. Then Job endured nasty rashes, boils, and blisters all over his body, infection after infection, and he's in constant and excruciating pain. So if we think back to Lucy now, we can better understand the origin of her disease's name. Infection after infection. In her case, primarily affecting the skin and the lungs. And if we can in any way imagine Lucy's experience, we can likely imagine that Lucy had her own enough is enough kind of list. In fact, later in the documentary, after Lucy's bone marrow transplant, she has emergency surgery to resection her right lung. A new infection snuck in and it threatened her life. And the documentary actually follows right along through this battle. But there's a clip of her after surgery, sitting in her hospital bed with her doctor, and she just looks up at her doctor and says this, "I don't like lung surgery." And basically, I feel like she just said in that moment, I have had enough of this. It was a terribly hard and scary period for her, and I can imagine that Lucy's parents were saying the same thing in spades. We have had enough of this, as they sat by her bedside through another hardship. So knowing Jan and then watching Lucy's story unfold on TV made me realize something. That there are some enough is enough moments that are different. That sometimes when we look around and we take inventory of our lives, we realize that we're in the valley and we're in the dark and in the midst of something hard, and it's not going to change anytime soon. That this isn't just a season. It's not temporary or short-lived. It's something all around us is hard. The hard stuff is everywhere. It's all we can see. And when that's our experience, it can be hard to see any good, let alone hold on to it. At some point, we're probably all going to be in some kind of orbit like this, where this is true. So whether you're in the center, like Jan or like Lucy, or if you're adjacent to it, a friend or a family member, and the scenery around us at these moments in our lives can look very dramatically different. It might be, like Lucy, a lifelong health crisis. Or it could be a chronic illness, parenting struggles, family trauma, relationship issues. And they all could possibly be saturated in feelings like fear, sadness, worry, grief, regret, anger. I could go on. So it seems like this, right, is a good place for us to think together, to wonder whether there's any good when what we're surrounded by on all sides is stuff that just isn't. If we're in the center of the orbit, is there any good for us to grab a hold of? Is there any good to help us through? I know in my own life, whether the hard stuff is my own or that of someone close to me, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to even ask the question, is there anything good here when I am deep in hardship or grief? If I think about Jan, I can imagine all the questions that I would be asking instead. Why me? Why my daughter? I'd be thinking of all the ways I had envisioned my life and my future and my family. And then I'd be comparing it to the reality of lengthy hospital stays. 6 years, Lucy had over 13 hospitalizations, and several were for stays much longer than a month. So Jan, who'd envisioned a career as an elementary school teacher, has instead become a sort of nurse and an expert in Job syndrome. And then what about Jan and Scott's son, Joel? How will he fare through this journey? Will he lose his sister? Will they lose their daughter? Not to mention all the practical stuff. There are worries about finances and employment, worries about their own mental health and self-care. And because Job syndrome has no cure and really very little data to predict the future, the bigger question, is this forever? And how, if so, will we ever keep putting one foot in front of the other? Job, the biblical character, not the disease, asked these same questions. He asked them directly to God when he faced affliction after affliction after affliction. In chapter 3, Job actually laments his own birth. He wonders before God why he even exists if it's just for this suffering. And in chapter 6, he says this about his situation in verses 2 and 3. Oh, that my grief were actually weighed, all of it were lifted up in scales. For now it's heavier than the sands of the sea. Therefore my words are rash. My grief is heavier than the sands of the sea, Job says in chapter 6. And it just continues throughout the book of Job. In chapter 16, he cries out to God that he is worn out and that his family, his household has been devastated. In chapter 30, he declares that he is still in constant pain and that he walks in the dark. And I read this and I just hear my friends crying out all the same things. But what's significant here is that Job, in the midst of his darkness and his destruction, he gives a voice to all of it. He is not pretending to be okay, not to others and not to himself. He is not suffering silently, and he's not suffering alone. Throughout his story, he continues to declare that he is not okay. He says to God on repeat and to his wife and his friends over and over. And I read this and I wonder, would I do the same in Job's shoes? Have I done the same in my own life? Or have I lessened my difficult trials, minimized them, minimized my feelings of distress? Have I done that in an effort to seem strong or to be less of a burden to the people around me? Have I kept it all to myself? Jan, who probably qualifies right alongside Job as an expert in long-term hardship, she reacted to pain just like Job did, but not without hesitation. She actually confessed to me recently that as a follower of Jesus, she often felt like she was expected to look for, find, and focus on the silver lining. So in all of their trials, that seemed to be what she thought she needed to be finding, right? The silver lining. But her experiences have helped her to see that suffering doesn't always have a silver lining. So maybe it's in both Job's and Jan's reaction where we can ask, can there be good even without a silver lining? Can there be good in situations that never change? And then where can we find good even amidst all of the bad? Sometimes when all the things are hard, it's not about silver lining. In Jan's experience, she found that the good came when she recognized that it was okay to not be okay. That when their community rallied around them in support, it wasn't in platitudes or endless optimism or silver linings where Jan felt any good. It was in the affirmation that she received that all of her anger, all of her confusion, all of her doubt and frustration were okay. She didn't have to be ashamed of her pain, her worry, her grief. In Jan's words, it was in the discovery that God's chest is big enough for us to beat on. That's where the good snuck in. And I think Job knew this to be true as well. Because as few of his friends actually tried desperately to find a reason for his suffering, they tried to justify it, explain it, or look to the future. Job remained steadfast in his declaration that sometimes things are just hard. And finding an explanation or a silver lining wasn't going to change that fact. But he also had a God whose chest is big enough to beat on. And so that's what he did, and that's what sustained him. So 10 years ago, I got married, and that day catapulted me into my own enough is enough kind of difficult journey, one that still echoes in lots of areas in my life today. And then the day after my wedding, Jan and Scott welcomed sweet Lucy into the world, catapulting their family into their own enough is enough situation, parts of which they have been gracious enough to share with the world through the First in Human docuseries. My story doesn't look like theirs, or like Job's, but I need the reminding that their stories offer me. So in the same way, your story might not look like any of these, but all of these things are still true. When we share our stories, when we share our hardships, our true and honest, I have had enough moments and feelings, good can be found there. Even when nothing about the situation is good. It can be found in the community of people who make sure you know that it's okay to not be okay. And of people who make sure that you can find a God who can handle all your hurt, all your grief, all your frustration, and all your pain. Let's keep, in Jan's words, saturating ourselves in those truths. And together, maybe we can help each other hold on. Amen.